and by encouraging more people to come to China, visit for themselves, understand.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. 2023 marked a vibrant year in China's diplomacy, with dozens of state leaders from major powers and small countries paying official visits to China, and President Xi Jinping meeting for a face-to-face summit with the U.S. President Joe Biden in November. Meanwhile, China has been making great efforts to bring peace to parts of the world, such as Ukraine and the Middle East. What diplomatic achievements did China make in 2023? Is China on better terms with Western powers such as the U.S. and the EU? And what progress did China make in contributing to multilateralism and global governance? Join us for this year-end special discussion from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. We are happy to have Dr. Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy, and Zun Ahmad Khan, Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
We started with an interview, actually. In the recent interview, Danilo Turk, former president of Slovenia and also president of the World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid, he said China was not only very active, but also very successful. He was talking about the 2023 of China. I wonder, what's your take? I will start with Zun here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Qinduo, for having me on the program. I think I do have to completely agree with this statement. China has been proactive in terms of being very forward-looking and also promoting multilateralism, promoting a balanced foreign policy that takes into view all different parts of the world, the respectability that China is giving many countries that are maybe developing or facing challenges is something very important. It's something the world has been looking for.
Zhao Hai, so balanced and also proactive achievements in terms of bringing peace and stability.
I agree with the two. First of all, this is a very active diplomatic year for China, because this is the first year the world is walking out of the pandemic. And for the past 3 years, diplomacy as well as global situation is changing dramatically. And some trends has been accelerated by the development of AI, by the development of the global climate change, and also by the development of the various changing of global supply chain. So you can see that underneath, there are a lot of factors that are changing after the pandemic. And there is extensive research showing that after pandemic, normally global order will go through a chaotic stage because of power vacuum, because of the changing of the population distribution, and also immigration. All kinds of factors are here. So China has very clearly stated that we want global stability, and China has been striving for that, doing our own part of the work, trying to bring stability to the world.
One big factor, obviously we'll touch upon that, is the China-U.S. relationship. We have seen, a flurry of U.S. visits by senior officials to Beijing in the first half of this year, and then, of course, the summit between the two leaders in San Francisco. So after that, people seems to be cautiously optimistic about the ties between the two most powerful countries, two biggest economies. Zhao Hai, I wonder, what's your prediction? How do you see the relationship between Beijing and Washington now and into the near future?
Well, first of all, one of the fundamental problems with the U.S. is that its perception of China is not only wrong, but also their policy following this wrong perception, which make China-U.S. relations very difficult. And because of domestic issues between the two sort of parties or two different factions, they have an internal struggle and they have a spillover effect, making this bilateral relations more confusing and problematic. So this year, what we have done is trying to communicate with the U.S. side, clearly conveying our message to the other side, showing that our real strategic intention, not wrongfully interpreted by the other side, but our true intentions, and that gives a better perception for both sides. And the progress is that before and after the San Francisco summit, bilateral contacts, the channels of communication, is gradually reestablished. on economic side, on diplomatic side, and right now on military side. So that's a good sign that two powers are communicating with each side and manage this very complex relationship responsibly. So moving forward, I'm cautiously positive about this bilateral relationship coming next year, even though there's election year in the U.S. We're worried about and concerned about the effect of the U.S. election on the bilateral relationship, but still, I think the strategic understanding of the bilateral relationship is clarifying, and at least right now, the Biden administration, the decision makers, have a clear-eyed understanding of the importance of this bilateral relationship, and particularly in this destabilizing world, a stable and improving bilateral relationship between China and U.S. is critically important for maintaining global peace.
Yeah, I understand. I think a lot of people understand that this relationship is critically important to both countries, but also to the rest of the world, given their the role they played in. But at the same time, you do see people see it, in I would say, different shapes, different opinions about where we are and what's the nature of this relationship. For example, in February, Dialogue interviewed Professor John Mearshammer, from the University of Chicago. According to him, there is no question that China and the U.S. are in the new Cold War. Let's take a listen.
There's no question we're in a new Cold War. And when President Biden says he doesn't seek a new Cold War, what he's trying to do rhetorically is say, I'm not responsible for the new Cold War. The Chinese are responsible for the new Cold War. And you see the same thing going on with regard to Russia in the Ukraine crisis. What the Americans are dedicated to doing is blaming the Russians for the Ukraine war and making sure that nobody thinks that the United States and its allies are responsible for that new Cold War. But we are in a new Cold War, and that applies to Asia as well as to Europe at this point in time. Now, a lot of people say, well, if we're in a new Cold War, why are we having all this trade between China and the United States? Look, there's no question you're going to have a lot of trade over time between China and the United States. You want to remember, you had a lot of trade in Europe before World War I, but you still had World War I. You could have a great deal of economic intercourse between two countries that are bitter security rivals. So you see this happen over time in places like Europe and even in places like East Asia. But it's very important to understand that there is one kind of trade where the security competition is very much at play, and this involves cutting-edge technologies. The United States is playing hardball with China, not in terms of overall trade, but with regard to trade that involves cutting-edge technologies. What the United States wants to do is make sure it remains the world's leading country in terms of developing cutting-edge technologies and making sure that China is not a serious rival on that front. So what you see today and what you're definitely going to see moving forward is the United States making efforts to influence trade that involves high technology, but not influencing trade that involves other kinds of goods. And by the way, you'll see this with regard to trade involving Europe and China. The Americans will protest greatly if the Europeans trade technologies with China that will help China maintain its sophisticated technological industries. But otherwise, the Americans will not protest much if the Europeans trade with China.
So, Zuan, do you agree with John that we are now in the new Cold War between Beijing and Washington?
Comparing the current dynamic with the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, let's say, would be pretty flawed because the economic intertwinedness of both China and the U.S. is very different. The world is in a different shape. I mean, China is not ideological. China is very pragmatic, and China is, I think, if there is, from a developing country perspective, China is stepping in to just help countries address very pragmatic challenges. And in that sense, I think there is no such consensus in China to see when can we overtake the United States. It's really about stability, moving forward, and having very specific national goals and aspirations, and seeing how, whether it's the US, Europe, or other parts of the world, how they align with China's vision. So I personally disagree. We do not see a Cold War shaping up. There is definitely, like Zhao Hai also mentioned, a need to be more clear. China has been, again, very active in articulating and conveying what the relationship in different perspectives, very practical, economic, technology, climate change, overall global governance, poverty alleviation, development of the world at large, what China wants that relationship to look like. We have the opportunity, even globally, entire regions and continents are much more vocal about what they expect from China, from the US, and that will create a situation where their voices and their priorities will be more central to where the relationship is heading.
You look at the China-EU, probably that's, I'm not sure whether that's a better term to describe this relationship. We do see EU leaders, including leaders at the EU level and also at the individual nations level, French, German leaders. They were in China, the Chinese premier was in Europe. We do see a summit also at the end of the year between the two sides. So, 2023, how do you characterize this year for China-EU relationship here, Zhao Hai?
Well, I think it's a difficult year for China-EU relationship, even though by the end of the year, it seems to be hopeful that bilateral relationship is improving. However, there are limits and there are still problems that needs to be resolved. I think most prominent feature of this year is that because of the conflict in Ukraine, European Union and major powers in Europe seems to be losing its strategic autonomy. And for China, that's a problem because when Europe has its strategic autonomy, that's better for China-EU relationship because EU will make their own decision. And because EU has no fundamental geopolitical conflict with China, it can treat China more fairly with a balanced policy. But because they're more concerned about Russia and because of China-Russia relationship, EU is more and more getting closer to the United States and become captive of the US foreign policy. So that makes EU policy towards China more difficult and sometimes more complicated and also more confusing for China because of the sort of definition of China, either as a partner or as a competitor or even as a systematic rival. So because of this, I think China is trying to clarify EU's position and continue to support EU's strategic autonomy. And that means that China will continue to develop a relationship with the EU and sometimes will take unilateral actions trying to persuade EU that China's policy is consistent and is not a threat to EU's long-term interest. And China is trying to contribute to the peaceful resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. So I think it's a very difficult relationship to manage in the coming years, but hopefully we will gradually sort of making this relationship more mutually understanding and mutually respect.
Speak of the EU position or their China policy. Let's take a listen of my interview with Wu Hongbo, a special representative of the Chinese government on European affairs. Ambassador Wu talked about, basically he said the EU is positioning China and he's very confusing. Let's take a look.
I've been talking to many European friends. I say, you and I, both drivers, when we drive a car to a crossroad, then you are expecting one light, either red, green, or yellow. But now we have a strange situation. You have 3 lights on at the same time. Perhaps green as a partner, and the yellow as competitor, and red like the systemic rival. So not Chinese are being confused whether we're going to drive forward or backward or stop there forever. Even the European friends are confused themselves. If we have a different social system with the European Union and we become rivals, then actually this is the status quo 20 years ago. Why the European partners did not say then you are systemic rival? Why now? And this is really harmful. So I do hope that the European Union friends and the governments would stick to the original definition of our relations, that is comprehensive strategic partnership.
Yes, Zun. Of course, if you, from the Chinese point of view, if you look at EU's policy on China, it's a partner, it's a competitor, it's a systematic rival. And many people feel puzzled, like in particular, like a systematic rival. As you said earlier, China does not, export its ideology. It's not ideological. We understand that there are different systems, but it's okay. We are fine, perfectly fine with that. We can continue with our trade and investment, business as usual. But somehow the EU see things differently.
The European scholar emphasized that China thinks strategic autonomy for the EU means equality in relations, in mentality, in mindset, attitude towards the US and China. But actually, strategic autonomy should mean, maybe, I don't know what others would think, but it should mean that these two relationships, whatever the dynamic between the US and China, the EU's approach towards either has to be independent. And the distance will depend on the bilateral, Beijing's relationship with Brussels versus Washington's with Brussels. And later in the conversation, actually some others pointed out that even in Europe, in the EU, we do not have a definition. We don't really understand what exactly, there is no consensus on what is strategic autonomy. There is no real consensus on even, they don't say decoupling, they say de-risking. What is de-risking? It is just a notch below what the United States is saying. It is less extreme. It is maybe more in line with at least 2 decades of overall Europe's growing relationship with China. China is creating a situation as much as possible by being open, by listening to these growing complex issues that somehow are maybe a result of influence by of the US and maybe the hostilities or the situation amidst the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It is definitely a more dire situation, but China has been very open, and by encouraging more people to come to China, visit for themselves, understand, I think it's opening room for dialogue, for reminding ourselves, like as you said, there's nothing ideological about this relationship. There are interests that align. The EU can benefit from expanding cooperation with China and vice versa.
Related to China-U.S. relationship or China-EU relationship, actually it's about their views and points and approaches to the conflicts, not only in Ukraine, but also in Gaza. That somehow is dividing the world in a sense. I raised this question to a U.S. scholar at Paris Peace Forum about the Western practice. Let's take a listen.
Hello, yes, I come from China, CGTN. I have a question for the pricing crisis in Gaza. When we talk about Ukraine, we say Russian actions there, the killing of civilians and children. We say genocide, massacre. But now, more than 10,000 Palestinians have been killed. More than half of them are children. And very few from the West to term that as a genocide or, as a cruel atrocity. We have to stop. Is there a practice of double standards?
With respect to the question on Gaza from our Chinese colleague, my position is Israel has a right to defend itself, but its violations of international humanitarian law, as I see it, are both immoral and also counterproductive to the interests of both Israel and to the broader region. I think that this is an area where the United States has to be very careful. And in addition to European allies, to be much more sensitive. I'm not saying that they haven't said important words, but to try to exercise some restraint on Israel in its very violent campaign to go after Hamas.
How do you compare their practice here?
First of all, it's not something new for this region to be treated as less human in many ways. I mean, we have seen millions that have perished over various wars, various interventions, wars against terror, etc., over the last, especially 20 years. And sometimes these were called blind wars, and there was less of an inclination to even recognize the extent of human suffering. So what's happening in Gaza, there is no secret that even though we are seeing some of the most horrific, maybe the most horrific images that the world has been exposed to, we are seeing death toll, especially of children. There is absolutely a double standard. There is a tendency to belittle or even to justify the suffering, the scale of human suffering that's happening. And I think this is something a major part of the world has been exhausted, has seen over decades already, and it isn't something new. So I would say, actually, it's important to note China's role. China is supporting international humanitarian law, is respecting all of those treaties, the Geneva Convention. China is playing a very responsible role in the UN Security Council. And this role, China's proactive involvement right now,
Back on Chinese diplomacy, Zhao Hai, people would ask, remember also in the 2023, China brokered this sort of peace process between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The two countries resumed the diplomatic relationship there. So people would ask, what is the ultimate goal of China in terms of brokering peace, calling for ceasefire in this region?
I think China's approach now is very clear, contrast to other countries, particularly America, that we're approaching this through, first of all, having both sides willing to compromise with each other. And then as a third party, as a mediator, we could go in and bring them together. And then the second thing is that China never imposed its own will onto others. We always trying to find peaceful solution instead of military or sanction or other coercive means to achieve our own goal. And the third thing is that China always conduct quiet diplomacy because we can achieve something. We don't need to propagate this and make that a political capital for us because we don't have that
system.
The system of pressure that always trying to push you left and right because of interest groups that are involved. So I think on the one hand, China is a new emerging mediator in the world, and actually recently other countries, including Switzerland, recognize China's new role and trying to help China to cooperate and sort of intervene into other conflicts around the world, playing a bigger role, a very responsible great power role in the world. On the other hand, I think the world needs more of this kind of role because the conflict is emerging globally everywhere. And the thing is, without resolving some of the major conflict in the world, we're now seeing more small arms going through the world, potentially increasing terrorist attacks around the globe. And also, because of that, more crimes are crossing borders. So actually, in this particular moment, we need more global multilateral cooperation. And China is more willing to cooperate, but without ideological prejudice, without bias against China. And other countries are more willing to also participate in this coalition for peace and development. That's why China 3 global initiative is so important, because that shows the real intention of China globally.
Zhao had mentioned multilateralism. It reminds me of the expansion of the BRICS countries group and this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So how do you see that of it's almost like a trend or the development there. 6 new members, they are going to join the BRICS group.
A lot of people will ask, what does BRICS, even BRICS expansion, right? I mean, these countries, what do they really have in common? What do they, are they trying to de-dollarize? Are they trying to build, is it an anti-hegemonic alliance? But essentially, it's just countries coming together and seeing what they have in common, realizing that historically, or at least in recent decades, they have not benefited from certain global institutions that determine opportunities for them. So why not have more of a stake, more of a voice? Let's come together, find solutions that are that work for all of us. Let's improve the strength of our voice and the understanding of what we need to do in order to be better off every passing year. I think that's really the mindset. So China's coming in, and promoting multilateralism that is inclusive, that recognizes the common ground, the common denominator that countries and regions want to develop. They are sick of ideologies being imposed on them, and they're not thinking about dethroning an empire. They're just thinking about what are their pragmatic needs and being part of solutions that are needed for their region.
Briefly, 2024 for the Chinese diplomacy, Zhao Hai.
Yeah, I think the world order is in transition, and everybody knows the unipolar moment is over. And now we're heading towards the real multipolar world. And 2024 will be a year, continue to be in transition, and there will be a lot of danger outside because of the factors that I mentioned still moving forward and pushing this world, having a lot of changes. For China, on the one hand, we need to stay on the right side of history and continue to promote peace and development around the world. But at the same time, we need to defend our core interest against anyone who try to undermine it. So I think China facing a lot of challenges in the future, and particularly in the year of 2024. It's a major year of election. There are a lot of political disturbing moments. But at the same time, I think China will just focus on what it does best by developing its own economy, taking care of its own people, and also bringing people who share have a like-minded country who share our same goal of a community of shared future. I think that will be the defining year for China's diplomacy of 2024.
Well, thank you, Zun. Thank you, Zhao Hai. With that, we come to the end for today's special discussion. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Jingduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.